Hi, good people. Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternative history podcast. This is Chris here. If you haven't noticed, one of the things we constantly try and harp on is trying to get listeners to come out to give us some feedback and to give us some ideas about what they would like to see. And today I am joined by somebody else who did that. It's kind of how I got started, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity to introduce Marcos. You want to give a quick little introduction there?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Marcos. I am a listener of the Forgan Time that I started a couple of months ago. I got very intrigued into the podcast because I'm a person that loves history, especially war history. And when I saw all these alternate stuff that came to my mind, is there a podcast I could find? And luckily, I found this podcast, Fork in Time, and basically got my interest in maybe trying to help out the crew and giving them ideas about the alternate histories.
Great, great. So, if you want to go ahead and talk a little bit about the topic you gave us.
So, topic I gave the Fork in Time members is basically the Russian Civil War and the idea of a white Russian victory. As we all know, communism was a major factor for most of us in our time, from all the way from the end of World War II up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we experienced and seen what communists can do. And we see the attempts that people try to get rid of it. But the United States wasn't the first people to get rid of communism. It was actually the Russian people themselves. So it starts off with the White Russians, and their attempt trying to overthrow the Russian Civil War, overthrow the Soviet Republic.
So, basically, the Russian Civil War, when you have a revolution that doesn't quite succeed, yet you have a civil war. And what happened with the Russian Civil War is the Bolsheviks tried to seize power. They were successful in major cities, but they never made it out to the countryside. So we'll get a little more into the personalities involved, but the a lot of the Russian generals were very tied to the old imperial order. They fled outside of kind of a swath of northwestern Russia, kind of running from So these places change names a lot here. I'm going to try and give us references, but swath from St. Petersburg, Petrograd, Leningrad, those are all one city. Don't try and find them all on the same map. Um, Kind of running southeast to Moscow. But outside of that, you had nationalities trying to break away. You had other political parties trying to get together and destroy the Soviet power. So they didn't succeed initially, and the Civil War is them sorting this out. Would you agree with that?
I will agree with that.
So we talked about one of the forks being. So we're going to start and talk about Lavar Kornilov, right? But correct me pronunciations if you have
Uh,
any ideas. Better than I do.
it's fine. It's pronounced Larv Kornilov. But should we like introduce it like to the maybe backstory of like how this ends up to the
Mhm.
Civil War and everything?
Yeah, I was thinking starting with Kornilov affair.
Okay. Basically, it's around 1917. Russia already pulled out of the First World War, and the people in the Duma are arguing over the intent of what they should do, what Russia should do. And there's in the Duma, there are groups of Soviets that are trying to follow this ideology of trying to have everyone be equally shared in the government. And this goes to, and even though it's supported by the masses, like the peasants, it's not supported by people up in power. One of those people is Larv Kornilov. Was a general in the First World War that served under the Russian Empire, and he had a taste of not liking red or any left wings, and he sees that the people in the Duma are a threat to the whole Russian Empire. So he goes into the Duma and tries to have this affair, which is known in history as the Kornilov affair. Kerensky, at the time, is the head of the provisional government. And Kerensky saw this act as a betrayal to Russia and to the people. In order for him to stop the affair, he recruits the Soviets, and the Soviets begin arming the peasants there, and they're able to capture and arrest Kornilov.
And this happens like August 1917, and like 3 months later is the October Revolution. So this is kind of the beginning of the end of Kerensky, where he has to depend on the Bolsheviks to stay in power. And that, that arming, that legitimization of the Soviets really sets them up to take power just a couple of months later, right?
Right.
So in our timeline, like I was trying to kind of give a picture, the October Revolution happens in November, calendar change. And basically they take over, major cities, but that's it. And in our timeline, what happened is all of these disparate groups, basically you had the anti-communist, but it wasn't one unified. Nobody got together and determined what it meant to be anti-communist.
They were only. Oh,
Mhm.
sorry. They were only.
No, please.
The white forces were only unified under the belief of like only being anti-communist, but but most of these people were like divided in other of government ideology. Some were either supporting a republic, a return to a constitutional monarchy. Different groups. We have conservative, we have liberal, we have socialists.
Mhm.
But the only unifying factor was a just a defeat of the Russians, Soviets
Mhm.
in Russia.
And you also had, if you can believe, this is one of the first, and really, other than the Spanish Civil War, this is one of the only times you have a large, active anarchist movement in Ukraine. And it's not just a matter of like what kind of political organization do we want? It's a matter of which political organization are we a member of? Because it's not just everybody having, the Bolsheviks, the socialists, the liberals, the conservatives, the monarchists. You also have this splitting along ethnic and national lines, similar to what, today the Russian Empire, the Russian Federation today is a lot smaller than the Russian Empire we're talking about, because you had Belarusians, the Baltics, you had Poles, you had Finns, you had Ukrainians, you had the Caucasus, you had Central Asia, all of these places that were part of the Russian Empire and are now trying to break away. And by the way, within each of these groups, within each of these nations that is, trying to form its own entity, you have all of these political divides as well. So sometimes you'll have, you know, Azerbaijani socialist allying with the Russian socialist, but sometimes the Ukrainian socialist don't want anything to do with the Russian socialist. So it's just, I mean, it's a free for all over the place, right?
Yeah, it's kind of a free for all. Basically, the whole white room was like saying which group will come out on top
Mhm.
and transfer power, rather than like just collectively coming together and then sorting out who will get power afterwards.
Mhm. So what happened in our timeline is, all of these generals flee from the centers, from the Soviet areas, and start setting up their own flags all over. At one point, there's an admiral out in Siberia. Look at a map, see how much sense that makes. You've got a lot of them in southern Russia. You've got some in the Baltic, some up in Murmansk area, and they just kind of spread all out. And at different points, each of them kind of gets their power together and tries to march on the Soviet center. But the thing is, you know, they're not talking to each other. They're not coordinating their efforts. They might hate the Soviets, but they're just as likely to start fighting with each other as soon as that's done. And so, what the Soviets are able to do is, and you'll see this, they're able to have their army fighting Kolchak in Siberia. And as soon as they're done there, hey, the Dinkin and Wrangel in the south are advancing, so they'll be able to transfer their troops there. And they're able to basically run around playing whack-a-mole, but because nobody's working together and attacking at the same point, they're always able to move people around to beat whatever white army happens to be attacking them right then and there.
Yeah, we can't also forget that the Soviets have the industrial heartland. The whites are also scattered in like the agrarian society, and even from fact, the Soviets weren't even unified yet. They were not even consolidating. They were not even less. They're less experienced than the white soldier, white generals, but they're able to take advantage of the divide of the white generals, and they're able to come together and able to concentrate their force on some sectors. Like they were able to push back in the Archangel campaign with fighting against even the Americans, the British, the French there, and then they're able to stop in in Donbass with against British interventionists, British expeditionary forces, and Denkin and Wrangel.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, one of the big reasons the Soviets succeed is because they're not fighting one person, they're fighting everybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, looking at the history, we kind of came up with a really interesting option, which is Kornilov, who we talked about earlier, who when he when he when the Kornilov affair happened, when he tried to overthrow the provisional government, he was the commander in chief of the Russian army. So when he's arrested, he escapes, and what happens when he escapes is he flees to southern Russia and he gathers troops. He gather the important thing about what he's able to do in southern Russia is he is able to gather both Cossacks, who are a distinct group. They're not regular Russians. He's able to get them to work with regular kind of conservative monarchist Russian officers because he's both. He has his feet in both camps. He is a Cossack, but he also is recognized as the commander in chief by the Russians, and he is able to bring these two groups together and start trying to push back against the Soviets. As soon as he starts doing this, it just so happens that the Soviets launch one artillery shell. I mean, I'm sure they were launching a couple others, but they got very lucky. They launched an artillery shell that hit um, Kornilov's headquarters and killed him and his staff. So now this, you finally you had somebody who might have been able to keep everything together. And in our timeline, he's gone. What if like a gust of wind just happened to work at the right time and he survives? So if he survives, you want to talk a little bit about what we thought might happen?
Yeah, but I was gonna also add like
Sure.
Kornilov, mostly generals were different. For instance, Kornilov, he wasn't raised like in the like in a no like in a nobility or like the like
Mm-hmm.
in the upper class. He was mostly in the lower class. Like unlike many believe, he was in Donbass region. He was seen as a minority, and he was able to climb up the ranks to become a general. We can also see it with Denkin, who as well he was a Polish man who was from the lower class, and he was as well climb up. So it kind of shows that not all the generals were from higher nobility or
Mm-hmm.
became generals because of like their where their classes are, but they actually worked hard. So I believe that it's also admired by the soldiers who don't believe that hey, he's just a general because he's from the upper class. No, he is a general because he worked hard and got
Mm-hmm.
to where he is.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the interesting things. Um, I hate doing it, but I kind of feel I want to jump back and forth a little bit. Do you want to after I really hate doing this. I please people try and follow along because it's gonna get confusing. In our timeline, two of the generals, you talked about Denikin, who winds up taking over for him, and towards the end of 1918, 1919, all at that point, after a lot of damage has been done, people finally started to kind of gather behind Denkin. Denkin is a Russian, but he has another commander under him called Pyotr Wrangel, right?
Yes.
And Wrangel is a Cossack. So not just that divide, but those two people. Do you want to talk a little bit about like how that divide, really hurt their chances in 1919?
Sure, we can talk about that.
So go ahead. Wrangel is, commander of kind of a Cossack, kind of a cavalry group attacking Tsaritsyn, right? Um, which, again, I warned you ahead of time, places change names. That's Stalingrad to us. It's Volgograd today, but like
Yeah.
it's Stalingrad. If you know
It's
Russian
actually
history, it's Stalingrad. That's
it's a
what it
significant
is.
because like you see back then it's called Tsaritsyn because of the leader, and then it's called Stalingrad because of the leader. Now it's called Volgograd for modern times. You see, it's like a significant change in the Russian history. It's
Mhm,
significant.
mhm.
But
And
back to your
actually, yeah, actually, one of the reason it was called Stalingrad is because right at this point, when Wrangel is advancing on Tsaritsyn, um, Stalin is actually sent down there, and he doesn't do a whole lot to beat Wrangel. The Soviets are able to, and they go back and forth a couple of times. They're able to, but Stalin basically takes the PR win and paints the defense of Tsaritsyn as his personal victory. And he uses that a lot, later on when he's trying to gain power to kind of show his credentials, I'm a leader because I was able to defend this.
yes,
So Wrangel is kind of pushing towards Stalingrad. I'm going to keep saying Stalingrad because that's
yeah,
kind of what we're familiar with. But Denikin is trying to go towards Moscow, right?
yes.
And they're not supporting each other.
No, no
And this is another of those like,
factors.
yep. And there's something to be said for the fact that these are, two different people. If they're if Kornilov survives, both of these people answer to him. And he also is kind of like we were talking a little bit from both of these two groups. So that both of he has a connection to both of these people. So if Kornilov survives, it's very likely that not only do the Russian whites, do the non Bolshevik forces get behind him earlier, you talked a little bit about all of these interventionist forces.
Yes,
Um, the Soviets may have controlled what amounted to the Russian industrial heartland. Um, but man, when the British and the French turn on the tap, there's no way the Soviets could produce like comparable amounts, especially since the war's about to be over. They're going to have all of this stuff to just give away. And if they're all giving it to Kornilov, his troops are able to get equipment and to organize in a way that if every individual general is shouting and asking for supplies here and supplies there, again, they're kind of like splitting up their efforts, right?
right.
So if Kornilov is actually able to survive, how do you think the Civil War plays out?
Well, I still think there will be a little bit of a divide, but not to a certain extent. Mostly people will be united because before the Civil War, you remember the provisional government. Kornilov is the commander in chief of the all white army,
Mhm.
of the provisional Russian army, and still believe they will be able to win. I still think that I think there'll be even more supplies and help from foreign aid
Mhm.
because remember, World War One's already over, and most of these nations already just died out. They're already tired of like losing men and everything. So, and they're afraid mostly because some of their soldiers are communists and socialists,
Mhm.
and they didn't want to keep on sending men to die. So, if they saw that Kornilov as unifying the Russians and he is close to victory and he has a chance of winning, I think that the Americans, the French, the British, and fun fact, the Japanese as well, would go and send in more aid, foreign aid, military supplies,
Mhm.
troops to help Kornilov.
Mhm. Yeah, and honestly, I feel like the other part of it is you see this happen a lot in the Civil War, which is once the tide gets going one way or another, things just like both sides very much make use of each other's troops in that like um when it looks like the Soviets are winning, all a whole bunch of white soldiers put on different color armbands and run over to the Reds. When it looks like the Soviets are going to lose, a whole bunch of soldiers put on white armbands and run over to the whites.
Yeah,
So once like all the whites are working together, what you're gonna see is you're gonna have like a tidal shift, especially when you start seeing the West, the Allies, the Entente powers open up their supply lines and just start throwing, supplies. You're going to see a lot of Soviet troops switch over
yeah,
to the white.
defectors.
Exactly. And both sides used them. And in this case, I think, that's going to be important. So, like, we have first question is, do you think any of this fighting throughout 1918 is going to change anything about what happens in World War One, kind of Western Front?
1918. Well, right now, because before the Civil War, all
Mm-hmm.
the Russians and Germans signed the Treaty of Lovestic, I think it was called, and
Brest-Litovsk. Yep.
Lesbethov. So all Eastern German forces are already heading back to Western France.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it will still play out, but I feel like instead of crippling the German army and everything, I think the Allies will use the resources of the German Empire to continue funding the White Army up in the East.
Okay. So you think like, and this happened a little bit, but the Allies at this point the Allies weren't encouraging it, but in what you had in our a little bit was the creation of what were called Freikorps in both not so much we're not really talking about Germany, but in the East, groups of German veterans who would get together and they're called Freikorps. They're free corps. They're free because they're not answering to anybody, picturing kind of like almost
Partisans.
mercenaries just running around. And so you're saying you might see um you're saying that the fear of the Soviets basically would
Yes.
convince the British and the French to almost take German soldiers, you know what, it kind of a lot of what happened, what the French did after World War II. They took a bunch of German POWs, changed their uniforms, and sent them to fight in French colonies. We've got all these people that know how to fight. Let's go use them somewhere to do what we want them to do. And everybody is so afraid of communism that you think they would have, especially up in the Baltic republics where you did have a lot of ethnic Germans. You're thinking, the Allies would have turned the other, looked the other way in a way that they maybe not didn't in our timeline to German troops for all intents and purposes fighting against the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I think this would have been maybe an earlier version of I don't know what it's called, but like Operation, I don't think it's called Downfall, but it was like a proposed operation by Churchill to use German troops to invade the Soviet. It's like an earlier version of that.
Unthinkable.
Unthinkable, Operation Unthinkable, yes.
That was Germans and yeah, that was Germans, British, and Americans basically not stopping at the Elba. Um,
Yes.
so we think that 1918 plays out the way it does. By November-ish, you do have the German surrender. You do have Germans basically armed and sent east, 1919 to fight with a unified white movement. I mean, general and more than we all kind of still have images of Barbarossa in winter and Napoleon in winter. So, November is not a good time for this to happen. But by April 1919, you've got a unified white movement. You've got German troops coming in. You've got Allied supplies coming in. So, do what happened at that point?
But I think that in for the Soviet situation, they see that they're surrounded on all fronts.
Mhm.
I think you see the peasantry start to, or like people start to get anxious, and you see people start to lose trust with the Soviets. And you see the rate with like in our time with was it Fanny Kaplan?
Mhm.
She shoots Lenin. So I feel like this time in our time, her shot will actually kill Lenin.
Okay.
And you see there's more division inside the Soviets, and then this will allow for more troops to push in from the
Mhm.
whites and the Americans, the Germans. But I also could add that now with Kornilov under in charge, I think they could see. I don't know if this will happen, but maybe a from remember 1917, the Tsar dies. So I don't know if maybe with better cooperation with the Czech Legion, he was able to save the Tsars. What do you think?
I so I almost feel like so to talk a little bit about what happened to the Tsar. Um, the Soviets imprisoned him and his family. They're keeping them secure, but when they just they killed the family not as a show of strength,
A fear.
not the way the French guillotined Louis the 16th out of fear because the Czech Legion and the white forces of Siberia, Kolchak's people, are marching on the city where they hold them. And so to talk a little bit, Czech Legion, I know some of you are looking at a map and wondering what Czechoslovakia has to do with any of this. Here's what it does. These were prisoners of war. During World War One, these were Czechs that had been fighting in the Austrian army and were taken POW by the Russians. After the revolution, and all everybody did this. What happened is during the revolution, the government looked at all of these people they had, sitting in camps and said, you know what? If you'll join the Czech Legion, all these Czechs, if you'll join this legion, you can we will set you free, we will arm you, we will train you, you will fight for us, and we will use you to go into the Austrian Empire and create a free Czechoslovakia. None of that happens. Absolutely none of that happens because the provisional government isn't around long enough to do this, isn't around long enough to organize any of this. So now you've got all of these POWs that have been armed again and reorganized sitting in the middle of Russia. All they want to do is get out. That's all they want to do is and they wound up just somehow like trying to fight their way across so they could go home because by the time this is happening, there actually is a Czechoslovakia because Austria has collapsed. But you were right. It was not a sign of strength. It was a sign of weakness. I think the Soviets had the czar, and they're not going to let him get captured. Period. And the worse things go for the Soviets, the more dangerous things are for them. So it may not be the Czech Legion, it may not be Kolchak, it may be somebody else, it may be a different, house they're being held up in. But come the spring of 1919, they're gone. Um, which does lead us to an interesting kind of next question. So I think we agree, like, summer 1919, the Soviets are are done away with. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, they're already collapsing on all fronts.
Mhm. So once you remove that, what do you think? Like, what they're gone. Lenin's gone. Um, the Tsar is gone. What do you think happens then? Like, do
Well,
we have a military dictatorship? Do we try and find another czar? Do we try and find, another, descendant of the Romanovs to put on the throne? Do we try and reconstitute the Duma? And at the same time, the other question is, what do you think happens to the nationalities question? I've given you a lot, so let's
yeah.
start.
Well, I feel like now let's I want to start actually with the ideology. So I feel like
Mhm.
because in our timeline they thought communism can do something and help overthrow the government. In our now in this timeline with communism being destroyed, it will be seen by the world as a failure and ideology that's not feasible. So I think communism will rapidly decline rather than like faster in our timeline.
Mhm.
And in terms of the government, it's going to be kind of difficult with the government because remember the whites believe in different types of government. Some believe in a monarchy, in a constitutional monarchy, in a republic, in
Mhm.
a I don't know about military dictatorship, but I feel the two big ones would be either a constitutional monarchy or a republic.
Okay. Okay. So something similar to what the provisional government was trying to set up without also the Petrograd Soviet. Oh, and by the way, without being in the middle of losing a world war.
Exactly.
Okay. Um, so if you have something like that, like what about the nationalities? Is it a Russian republic? Is it kind of Russia within the borders that we kind of recognize today as a Russian Federation, or is this kind of a do they kind of because again, a lot of these people that are now returning to power were Russian imperialists. So are now that they have taken over Russia itself, do they go out and try and reestablish control over some of these other countries, or do they try and negotiate with these other countries, with the Ukrainians, with the Caucasus republics, with all these other countries? Do they try and negotiate kind of some kind of unity with them, allowing them some self-government, or do they just kind of say, you know what, like this is too much, we're just going to focus on Russia.
I feel like the I think more what I believe will happen will be like trying to reestablishment of the empire, but there's a difference. I think there will be a big difference. I think they'll give more independence to those other minorities,
Mhm.
national minorities. And if that doesn't happen, I feel like they will form like some sort of like alliance or like a try and like keep the empire of the old together. So
Okay.
maybe like a like a I don't know what was it called that after the collapse of the Union, it formed like a federate like a commonwealth.
Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS.
Yeah, the CIS. So yeah,
Mhm.
either that or back to the empire and try to reestablish control, but hopefully learning from their mistakes and giving them a little bit more autonomy and maybe more of a voice in the government.
Okay. So if they do this, if they embark on trying to reassert Russian authority, what happens to their support from the Entente?
Um, the support from the autonomy. Well, if there is reestablishment of the empire, I don't know who will be the czar, but
Mhm.
I feel like most of the on will be acceptable of a constitutional monarchy. No
Okay.
absolute monarchy. I don't think that will ever happen again of an absolute monarchy in Russia. So I don't know if maybe Tsar Krilovich will come into power after because of the assassination of both the Tsar, his kids, and his death of his brother.
Hmm.
So then I would say then I think they will accept it because like remember Britain is also a constitutional monarchy as an empire. So
Hmm.
the British will see maybe eye to eye with the Russians.
Okay.
And I think the French too, because remember in World War One, the French had strong relationships with the Russians.
Hmm.
So I think they will also accept it. For the United States, that's a little bit tricky because remember, President Wilson is the president at the time, and he doesn't believe he wanted to form like this new world order of like free nations.
Hmm.
So it'd be kind of hard for him to pass on these like his 11 points that are going
Hmm.
to be happening. I think he would accept a constitutional type of monarchy. I think he would, but I think he was have a little bit of distaste with the Russians.
Hmm. But at this point, also, and I know we've touched on this in other episodes. Wilson was trying to push his 14 points, was trying to push the League of Nations, was trying to push American involvement, and he was it. Nobody else in the United States wanted anything to do with anything else. So, if he's not dead set against something, America's not involved. Um, so I think, this is a really interesting point here. Now, to kind of think long term, like the Soviets aren't when I say Soviet, and I'm kind of good. I like to think I'm pretty good about stopping myself and saying Soviets versus Russians, not confusing them. But I understand, like a lot of people, like they're the same thing. Now they're not. And the big thing, and we talked a little bit about this off podcast. What do if the Soviet Union isn't constantly, there as communism threatening, almost like it's a base and it has its tentacles and it has its influence all over the world, and everyone is scared about this. If that's not happening, if Russia is just another, you know, constitutional monarchy, I set you up. Go ahead. What do you think changes in
Well,
a certain other country?
well, I think we will see a massive changes in one particular country. I think that would be China.
Okay. Okay.
Because you
Talk a
remember
little bit about that.
the Chinese right now during the First World War they overthrew the emperor and they established the republic. Then that republic was supported by the Kuomintang,
Mhm.
and it didn't agree with certain parts, and that split into start a civil war with the Kuomintang and Zhao's communists with Mao's
Yep.
communists. Now with the communists out of the picture, I think it'll be kind of tricky. I think now with the belief like communism is a bad ideology, I think they will either accept the Kuomintang's belief or be able to negotiate with them to unify China.
Okay. So you think China doesn't go through the Civil War? You mentioned Germany.
Germany, yes. For Germany, I think still Hitler will still come to power. But one of
Okay.
Hitler's biggest points and leverages for the against the people of Germany was the fear of communism.
Mhm.
And the fear of communism was because a lot of Germans were afraid that they saw how the communism overthrew the Russian Empire that was in power for over 300 years,
Mhm.
and one ideology and group of people overthrew that, and they didn't want that to happen to their own country. So Hitler went far right and was able to recruit these people by saying that if we win, the communism will stop, and they were able to establish stability in the
Mhm.
country. With that out of the picture, then the only thing that Hitler will have was just humiliation from the First World War.
Mhm.
I think he will still start the war, but I feel like it will be tougher. I think it will be a shorter war.
And something just came to my mind. Who humiliated Germany at the end of World War One?
it was the Allies. It was the
It was
French.
Britain. It was Britain and France.
Mhm.
Russia had nothing to do with it. So I think if he does come to power, I think it's a lot more likely that you have something akin to Molotov-Ribbentrop, where Germany and Russia come up with some kind of division of Eastern Europe because, again, but we touched on it. Both of them are looking to take over these tiny little countries that exist there now, and they'll make their deal. And it's so much more natural if you don't have a Hitler who has like come to power as the guy that hates what Russia represents,
Y-
Soviet communism and apartheid. If he is railing against Versailles, he's completely focused a different direction,
He's
right?
gonna be focusing on the Western Front rather than just trying to split Poland because I think Poland will be a part of the Russians. So I don't think he would try and invade a large country
Mm-hmm.
that's I feel like Russia and I forgot we touched upon it, I think Russia will establish a capitalist ideology rather than
Okay.
agrarian. It'll just way faster.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think Russia will also go through a period similar to Taiwan's White Terror.
Okay. Yeah. So
But
talk a little. What does that mean, by the way? Because man, I'm a little familiar with it, but I know what white terrors are. Talk a little bit about what you think that means.
what I believe is that White Terror is basically the execution or elimination of suspected communists in a certain country.
Okay. So you think like in the 1920s, basically after you have um after the end of the Civil War, you think whatever power takes over in Russia is going to really turn hard. Do you think you have kind of like them repressing like SRs and moderate socialists?
Um, yes, if they aligned with Lenin and Stalin, but if they didn't and they aligned with the whites, I think they wouldn't. They'll face maybe small repercussions for being that ideology, but if they align with Lenin, then yes, I think they will
Okay,
be facing
okay.
that.
So anything else come to mind about listen, like if you don't have the Soviet Union, like the entire 20th century has changed, and I think we don't want to really get into really deep tracks here, but does anything else come to mind about what you think? You've got a Germany kind of going west, whatever happens there, you know anything else come to mind about what a white victory would have led to?
Um, for Russia or like during World War II?
um Whichever, playing it out, like if Germany goes west, like does Russia eventually get involved? Do the United States get involved? What do you think?
I think the Russians will get involved because you remember the Rush in the First World War, the Russians and the French were strongly aligned, and then now during the Civil War, you see the French supply them with a lot of troops. So I
Mhm.
believe the Russians, in return of gratitude, they will declare war on the Germans and help win
Okay.
the war.
I like this. I like this because man, we've just changed something major, but like we still have the same old thing happening again. Um, So, okay. We kind of talked about this as kind of a stopping point because I think, I want to give everybody else, this is something we're working on now. We're really trying to get people to comment on the Discord server to give their feedback in terms of, what do you think about this? So we encourage everybody to do that. We encourage people to give us ideas about new topics. Maybe you two, hey, I started here. That's how I got started. That's how Marcos got started. Um, give us ideas on the Discord for new topics. We'd love to hear some. Um, yeah, anything else you'd like to say?
Um, I would like to well, I know like am I allowed to give some thankful tips to my to some teachers?
Sure, sure. Go ahead.
I'd like to thank my teacher, Dr. Luis de Borrego. for giving me a lot of history and like about also alternate history.
Mhm.
And I'd like to thank the Fork in Time group for expanding my alternate history mind, trying to see more realities of what they could have been, but fell short of or never happened.
Okay. Cool. Well, welcome to the team. Thanks for, giving us a suggestion. We'll try, we'll keep you in the loop in terms of other recordings, and just want to encourage everyone out there that if they should happen upon a fork in the road, to take it. Thanks, and talk to you guys later.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.